While I was leaning on a crutch, cooking with a broken leg, my daughter-in-law shoved boiling soup across my hand and snapped, "Get on the floor and clean it up right now." I refused. My son came through the door at that very moment and shouted, "Apologize to my wife and clean it." I cast my eyes down at the angry welt already rising on my hand, then brought my gaze up to meet my ungrateful son's. Then I turned and left, and began putting together a reckoning neither of them could have anticipated. Welcome back to Wise Revenge. I'm glad you're here. If stories like this one speak to you, consider following along so you don't miss the ones still to come. Before we begin, I'd love to know, what do you come to a story like this, hoping to find a sense that wrongs can be righted, or simply the comfort of knowing you're not alone? Drop a word below and let me know. A note before we go further: some details in today's story have been shaped for the purposes of telling it clearly, and any resemblance to specific real events or people is entirely coincidental. It's the truth inside the story that matters. 40 years as a carpenter will teach you one thing above all else: wood does not deceive you. Press your palm flat against a plank, shut your eyes, and it tells you everything: the grain, the knots, the places where the tree bent into the wind and held. People don't offer you that same honesty. I came to understand that later in life than I should have. The night that changed everything. I was at the stove on one good leg, the other wrapped in a fiberglass cast that ran from my ankle to just below my shin. The doctor had told me to stay off it as much as possible, advice delivered to a man who had spent 4 decades on his feet in a workshop, which gives you a fair sense of how seriously I was able to take it. Still, I was doing my best. A crutch hung from the cabinet handle beside me, and I was bracing my weight against the counter edge while I stirred a pot of beef and vegetable soup I had been tending for nearly 2 hours. Bridget had mentioned it that morning before heading out. Though mentioned is generous. She had stood in the kitchen doorway, coat on, keys already in hand, and said, "I want soup tonight, the real kind, not from a can." Then she walked out. I had long since understood that requests in that house came without please, and departed without thank you, and that the silence in between was mine to fill without complaint. So I stood there and stirred. My cast pulsed with a low, steady ache, as it always did when I'd been upright too long. The kitchen was fragrant with thyme and cracked pepper and something faintly herbal from the rosemary, the same blend Rosalind used to swear by whenever Colin came down with a cold as a boy. I stirred and listened to the neighborhood ease into evening. A dog barking 2 houses down, the refrigerator's quiet hum, the occasional car moving along the street outside. I heard Bridget's car pull into the driveway at 6:47. I know the precise time because I had just glanced at the clock to gauge whether the soup needed another 10 minutes. The front door opened, then shut with the particular force she used when her day had not gone as she'd hoped. She came straight into the kitchen without removing her coat. She looked at the pot. She looked at me. Then her gaze moved slowly to the floor near the base of the stove, where a few drops of broth had fallen when I'd adjusted my grip on the ladle. "Are you serious right now?" she said. It was not a question. "The floor's fine," I said. "I'll wipe it up once I'm done. That is hardwood, Leonard." She said my name the way people say a word they've grown tired of hearing. "Do you have any idea what broth does to hardwood? Get down there and wipe it up right now." I set the ladle across the rim of the pot. I met her gaze without flinching. "Bridget, I have a cast on my leg. I cannot get down on the floor and back up without help. The soup will be ready in 10 minutes. I'll clean the floor when it's done." Her expression shifted. There is a particular look people get when they realize the person in front of them will not yield, and they had not considered that outcome. Something draws tight around the eyes, Something firms in the jaw. "You are unbelievable." She said it quietly, her voice dropping to that register that was somehow worse than shouting. You stand in my kitchen all day making it smell like a nursing home. You drip broth on my floors, and now you're going to stand there and tell me no. You are a guest in this house, Leonard. You eat here, you sleep here, you use our water and our heat. And the one thing I ask you to do," I said quietly, "Bridget, I have cooked every meal in this house for the past 3 weeks. I have done the laundry. I have picked Declan up from school 11 times because you said you were busy. I have—" "Stop." She raised one hand palm forward like she was halting traffic. "Stop talking. You want a medal for doing the bare minimum while you live here for free. That is not generosity. That is rent. Get on the floor and clean it up." I did not move. She pulled out her phone and typed something. We stood there in that kitchen with the soup simmering between us, and my mind went to the 40 years I had spent making things with my hands, to the expression on Rosalind's face the morning we moved into our first house, to the boy I had driven 400 miles to watch cross a graduation stage. The front door opened again 7 minutes later. Colin, I could hear him set his keys on the entry table, the same spot every single night. A creature of habit, just as his mother had always said. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, still wearing his jacket, and looked at Bridget first. He always looked at Bridget first. "What happened?" he said. "Your father," she said, "refused to clean the floor. I asked him one simple thing." Colin turned to me. Something had been accumulating in his eyes for months, something I hadn't yet found the right word for. Not quite anger, more like the look of a man who has already chosen his place in the room before a single word has been spoken. "Dad," he said, "just clean the floor. It's not a big deal. I have a cast, Colin. I'll help you up after, just—" He exhaled, pressing the back of his neck with one hand. "Just do it, okay? Can you please just do it, and not turn this into a whole thing?" I stood there looking at my son in his kitchen doorway, asking me to lower myself onto a broken leg to wipe up 3 drops of broth, while his wife stood across the room with her arms folded and her chin raised, waiting to see what I would do. Something inside me went very quiet. Not cold, not hot still. The way a workshop falls silent just before you bring the blade to the wood, and there is no taking it back. "No," I said. "I won't." I reached over, turned the burner down to low so the soup wouldn't scorch, unhooked my crutch from the cabinet handle, and moved for the kitchen door. "Don't you walk away from me," Bridget said at my back, her voice climbing now, the careful quiet gone. "Don't you dare walk away. You are nothing in this house. Do you understand me? You are a charity case with a bad leg and an expiration date. And the moment we decide we're done being generous—" I kept walking. I had packed a bag 3 days earlier. Not because I had known it would happen that particular night, but because I had known the way you sense a storm before the sky shows it, that the night was drawing close. To understand why that bag was already waiting, you have to understand who I was before I ever walked through Colin's door. Not the man they saw, the old man on a crutch, moving too slowly through their kitchen, occupying space they had already decided they resented. The real version. The one who built things. I was born in Stockton, California, the second son of a man who repaired furniture for a living, and a woman who taught 3rd grade for 31 years. We were not wealthy. We were not struggling. We were the kind of family that fixed what broke rather than replaced it. And I carried that instinct into everything I ever put my hands on. At 19, I started sweeping floors at a woodworking shop in San Diego County, owned by a man named Alton Strick, who smelled of linseed oil and spoke in half sentences because he believed most things didn't require the other half. Alton taught me that good wood doesn't announce itself. You have to learn to see it. I worked under Alton for 6 years, then opened my own shop with $4,000 I had set aside and a handshake loan from my father that I repaid within 18 months. The shop was modest. 1 room, 2 workbenches, a second-hand band, saw that hummed like it had opinions, but it was mine. I called it Vance Woodcraft. Over the next 37 years, I built furniture cabinetry, decorative pieces, and eventually a small line of hand-carved art pieces that sold through 3 galleries in Southern California. Howie Mabry walked into my shop on a Tuesday in 1990 looking for someone to build a bookshelf for his wife's birthday. He had a hand-drawn sketch on a paper bag and a deadline of 2 weeks. I told him I could have it finished in 10 days. Howie and I have been friends for 33 years. He is the kind of man who shows up with a truck on moving day, who phones you on the anniversary of something hard because he kept track without being asked, who will argue with you fiercely and completely, and then press a beer into your hand, as if the whole thing never occurred. Rosalind always said Howie was the brother I never had. She was right the way she tended to be right about most things. I met Rosalind at a church potluck in 1984. She had brought a corn pudding she later admitted came entirely from the back of a cornmeal box, and I had brought a lopsided apple crisp that I had made from scratch and was quietly mortified by. We spent 40 minutes trading stories about our respective disasters before I asked if she'd like to get coffee sometime. She said yes before I had finished the question. We were married 11 months later, 38 years together. She taught kindergarten, I built furniture. We raised Colin in a house where I had made most of the shelving myself, in a neighborhood where we knew every family on the block by first name. It was not a dramatic life. It was a good one. I did not fully grasp until Rosalind got sick how much of the warmth in that house had been entirely her doing. She was diagnosed in the fall of 2021 pancreatic cancer, stage 3. The oncologist used the word aggressive, and I watched Rosalind sit across from him and nod with the same composed expression she wore when a student was telling her something hard. She wept later in the car, her forehead resting against my shoulder, her hand gripping my sleeve so tightly I felt each finger separately. I held her and fixed my eyes on the windshield, and made myself breathe slowly so she could not feel how hard my heart was hammering. Over the months that followed, I sold off half my remaining shop inventory to cover what insurance did not. I did not tell Colin the full amount. He had his own bills, his own pressures, and Rosalind made me promise not to burden him with guilt. So I dealt with it the way I had dealt with most hard things in my life, quietly, without making it anyone else's weight to carry. Rosalind passed on a Thursday morning in March of 2023, sunlight crossing the hospital window, my hand folded around hers. She was 61 years old. She had been planning to retire the coming June. The weeks that followed were the quietest I had ever known. Howie came by twice a week with food he pretended not to have cooked himself. Colette called every Sunday. The house which I had spent 40 years filling with handmade furniture felt like a museum to a life that had already ended. Then, on a Tuesday evening in early May, Colin called. His voice had the warmth that voices take on when someone has rehearsed what they are about to say. He told me I shouldn't be alone in that big house. He said Bridget had suggested I come stay with them for a while, that Declan would love having his grandfather close by, that they had the room, and it made sense. "We want to take care of you, Dad," he said. I stood in my kitchen holding the phone, looking at the chair where Rosalind used to sit and read after dinner, and I felt something ease inside my chest. Not joy, exactly. Relief. The particular relief of a man who has been carrying something very heavy and is offered somewhere to set it down. "All right," I said. "I'll come." Howie phoned the next morning. I told him about Colin's offer. A pause on the line. The specific pause Howie uses when he has something to say and is turning it over before he says it. "Len," he said at last. "You sure about this? He's my son, Howie." Another pause. "Yeah," Howie said. "I know he is. I moved in on a Tuesday in May. By Thursday, I understood that the house I had arrived at and the house Colin had described on the phone were not the same place. By Thursday, I mean this. Bridget sat me down at the kitchen table the morning after I arrived and handed me a sheet of paper she referred to as the house schedule. It was typed and formatted. My name appeared at the top with a colon followed by a column of daily responsibilities. Breakfast by 7. Declan's school pickup at 3:15. Dinner started by 5. Laundry sorted by color on Mondays and Thursdays. She slid it across the table with the brisk efficiency of someone onboarding a new hire and said, "We all contribute here. That's how this works." I looked at the paper. I looked at her. Then I folded it in half, set it beside my coffee cup, and said, "I'm happy to help out around the house, Bridget." She smiled the way people smile when they have already decided the conversation is finished. "Great," she said. Then she picked up her bag and left for work. I sat there for a long moment with my coffee going cold and the folded paper beside it, thinking about what Howie had not said on the phone. Thinking about that pause. Declan came downstairs 20 minutes later in his school clothes shirt on inside out. He was 8 years old, small for his age, with Colin's dark eyes and a gap between his front teeth that made him look like he was perpetually on the edge of a joke. He stopped when he spotted me at the table and said, "Grandpa, are you staying forever?" For a while I told him. He considered this with the gravity children bring when they are taking your answer more seriously than most adults would. Then he nodded and said, "Okay. Can you make pancakes?" I made pancakes. We sat together at the kitchen table with the morning light falling through the window above the sink, and Declan told me about his teacher and his best friend, and a turtle his school kept named Alton, who had escaped his tank twice. It was the best 20 minutes I had spent since Rosalind died. I didn't yet know how much I would come to depend on those 20 minutes to carry me through the rest of each day. The arrangement that took shape over the weeks that followed was not something that arrived all at once. It assembled itself by degrees the way water finds the lowest point in a room without seeming to move. I cooked. I cleaned. I sorted the laundry by color on Mondays and Thursdays as the paper instructed. I picked Declan up from school, helped him with his reading, and listened to every update he had about Alton the turtle. None of that was difficult. None of it felt wrong. Not at first. What shifted was the asking, or rather the end of it. Somewhere around the third week, requests stopped being requests. Bridget stopped saying, "Could you?" and started saying, "Make sure you." Colin stopped saying, "Thanks, Dad," and started eating with his eyes on his phone. The paper on the table became the invisible framework of every day, and I became the person responsible for keeping it upright, without acknowledgement, without variation, without the basic human courtesy of being addressed like a man who had once owned a business, raised a son, and buried a wife. I noticed it the way you notice a change in the weather, not the instant it happens, but the moment you realize it has already been underway for some time. One evening in late June, Bridget came home while I was finishing the dinner dishes and stood in the kitchen scrolling her phone. Without glancing up, she said, "I need you to reorganize the garage storage this weekend. The bins are a mess." "All right," I said, "and the guest bathroom needs a deep clean. The grout is getting dark." "All right." She looked up then, and for a moment something moved across her face, a brief recalibration, as though she had expected pushback and was mildly disappointed not to receive it. Then she raised her phone and took a photograph of me standing at the sink dish towel in hand gray-haired sleeves, rolled up the clean kitchen behind me. "What's that for?" I said. "My blog," she said, already typing. "It's content." I did not know what that meant. Not precisely. Not then. I found out 3 days later when Colette called and said, "Len, I was looking at Bridget's Instagram page. There's a photo of you at the sink with a caption about multi-generational living and the beauty of family showing up for each other." She paused. "She has 14,000 followers. The post has over 300 comments. People are calling you adorable." I stood in the backyard, holding my phone, the afternoon sun across my shoulders, and felt something I did not right away have a name for. Not quite anger. Something stiller and more erosive, the realization that I had been captured on camera without my consent and held up before strangers as proof of a domestic warmth that had never breathed a single day inside those four walls. Declan's birthday fell in August, and I rose before 5 to get to work on what I was making him. My fingers moved slower than they once did, and the cast made the workshop stool a wrestling match. But my carving tools had made the trip from the old house, and I had a clear picture in my mind of what I was after. A white oak keepsake box, his name cut into the lid in the lettering style I had spent 30 years refining. Somewhere for an 8-year-old to put whatever he decided was worth saving. I brought it to him after breakfast. He held it in both hands and examined it the way children do when they understand they are holding something deliberate. Then that gap-toothed face tilted up toward mine and he said, "Grandpa, did you make this yourself?" "I did," I said. "It smells like your workshop," he told me, and then buried his face against my middle and squeezed so hard I reached for the counter to keep from going over. Bridget came into the kitchen 20 minutes later. She spotted the box on the table lifted. It turned at once in her hands and placed it on the lid of the recycling bin by the back door. "We don't really do homemade gifts," she said. "It's a whole thing." Declan gets confused about what to appreciate. Declan was 4 feet away when she said it. Every muscle in his small face went quiet. Bridget left the room. He held perfectly still until the sound of her footsteps reached the top of the stairs. Then he crossed to the back door without making a sound, gathered the box against his chest with both hands, and took it out of the kitchen. The soft click of his bedroom door drifted down from above. I was alone in that kitchen. I pressed both palms flat to the counter, the same thing I do to a plank of wood when I need it to tell me the truth. Something irreversible had just taken place. What I didn't know yet was that it was only the first in a long series of such things. The 6-foot fiberglass ladder had been propped against the garage wall since before I ever arrived, waiting there like an old obligation. That morning, Bridget had mentioned, without lifting her eyes from her breakfast, that the holiday storage on the upper garage shelf needed to come down and be sorted before the weekend. She delivered this the way she delivered most directives, flatly, as though the execution were already decided, and only the labor remained in question. I looked at the ladder, then at my leg, which had been grinding at me since the afternoon before after 3 hours upright at the stove. My knee had been sending its complaints for 2 weeks by that point. Not the sudden alarming kind of pain, the slow-wearing kind, the kind a joint produces when you have been demanding more than it has left to offer. The right answer was to tell her no. Looking back, I'm certain of that. But no in that house was never the end of anything. It was always the prologue to something longer and worse. That morning, I couldn't afford the toll. I climbed 4 rungs. The box I needed sat on the 5th shelf, just inside reach if I leaned into it. I leaned. The ladder slid 2 inches left. No drama, no crash, nothing cinematic, just a small, almost polite failure. And then gravity had me, my right hand still extended toward a box of Christmas ornaments I never reached. I came down on my right side against the garage floor. My leg absorbed most of what happened next. What came out of my mouth is not something I'll put into words here. What I will say is that Loretta Braden, who lived immediately next door and had left her kitchen window open that morning, heard it clearly enough to come through the side gate at a dead run. She was beside me before my mind had fully caught up with what my body had just endured. Loretta was 58 years old, with 22 years behind her as a registered nurse at Scripps Mercy Hospital in Coronado before she stepped away from it. She'd moved to the street 4 years earlier after burying her own husband, and she carried the settled composure of a woman who had spent her career in rooms where losing your head was the one thing you couldn't afford. She came down to the floor beside me without a word of hesitation. Her hand went to my shoulder. "Leonard, don't move. Tell me where the pain is." "My leg," I said. "Right leg. On a scale of 1 to 10. 8, I said. A breath. 9. She dialed 911 with one hand and kept the other resting on my arm. She sat with me on that floor until the paramedics came through the door, talking in her even unhurried way about ordinary things. The weather a turtle Declan had described to her once across the fence, a dish she'd been meaning to cook. I knew what she was doing. She was holding my attention in the room. I was grateful for it in a way that language didn't quite reach. The injury turned out to be a clean fracture of the fibula, the slender bone that rides alongside the tibia between knee and ankle. The orthopedic surgeon at Scripps Mercy was a compact, exacting man named Dr. Harlan Merritt, whose face gave nothing away regardless of what he was about to tell you. He said I had come through lucky, the break was tidy, and the joint had been spared. 6 to 8 weeks in a fiberglass cast, minimal weight on the leg, those were the terms. Then he said something whose full weight I wouldn't feel until later. He told me that for patients in my age bracket recovering from this type of fracture, he sometimes arranged for a monitoring camera to be set up in the room where the patient spent the most time standing, to allow remote check-ins on gait and weight distribution during the recovery period. The practice offered it as a service. A compact unit roughly the dimensions of a smoke detector ceiling, mounted feeding into a secure patient portal that his team could access. Strictly for clinical use, he said. I agreed without turning it over much in my mind. A camera in the kitchen struck me as a minor imposition weighed against skipping the follow-up appointments every 2 weeks. Bridget, once Colin relayed the news that evening, shrugged and said fine, provided it wasn't an eyesore. Her assumption, I believe, was that the lens faced the floor to study how I walked. It didn't. It took in the full kitchen from a high corner angle, and it recorded audio as well. The doctor's office held the primary login. I had a secondary one that I never once opened. I returned from the hospital carrying the cast, the crutch, and a printed recovery sheet that Bridget set on the kitchen counter and never consulted again. 3 days on, a technician arrived, fixed the camera in the upper corner above the refrigerator, confirmed it was working, and left. It disappeared into the corner the way anything functional does when no one is searching for it. What caught me off guard was Colin. He showed up the evening I got back from the hospital, which meant something to me. He perched on the edge of the guest bed and wanted to know how I was holding up, whether there was anything I needed. For about 20 minutes, he was the version of my son I remembered from before all of this, present, attentive, a little unsure of his hands in the way he had always been when a moment asked something of him emotionally. I felt a tightness go out of my chest that I hadn't been conscious of carrying. 3 days after that, he asked if he could use my phone to sort out what he described as a billing problem with my insurance app. He settled in beside me on the couch and worked his thumb across the screen, his face giving nothing away. 8 minutes later, he handed it back and said everything checked out fine. That night, I went to call Colette. Nothing went through. Same result the next morning. I pulled up the contact. Her name was there, her number sitting exactly where I'd entered it years before, unchanged. But the line would not connect. I reasoned my way around it. Network trouble, I thought. She was probably away somewhere. I assembled a tidy row of small, believable explanations, because the other explanation that someone had altered something on a phone they had held for 8 minutes would have required me to look at my son in a way I wasn't prepared for yet. Colette hadn't stopped trying to reach me during that time. I had no idea. There is a kind of cruelty that knows how to dress itself as weariness. I had watched it taking shape in that house for months, in the flatness of Bridget's voice when she issued directives, in the way Colin's gaze drifted to his phone before I had finished speaking, in the small daily diminishments that meant nothing on their own, and everything in sum. The night of the soup was the night it stopped masking itself as something else. I had been on my feet since 2:00 in the afternoon. Bridget had sent a text from work. A text, not a call, because a call risks becoming a conversation, asking for beef and vegetable soup. Not a request. A notification. I read it standing in the kitchen doorway, crutch under my arm, the cast still on my leg, with 4 weeks left, before Dr. Merritt would clear it. And I made a choice I have since revisited. I decided to do it anyway. I told myself I was doing it for Declan. He had walked in from school that afternoon with red-rimmed eyes and a scratch along his forearm from the playground. He had settled onto the kitchen counter stool while I prepped the vegetables and explained to me in his careful, earnest way that a boy in his class had announced that grandfathers were too old to be good for anything. I kept working the knife through the carrots and said, "What did you tell him?" Declan took his time with it and said, "I told him my grandpa makes things with his hands that last longer than both of us." I kept my gaze on the cutting board so he wouldn't see what that did to my face. So I made the soup. I stood on one leg and one crutch for nearly 2 hours, adding the herbs. Rosalind had always used a bay leaf, a pinch of something she had kept in an unmarked jar that I had carried from the old house, because throwing it away was not something I was capable of. The kitchen filled with steam and the unhurried sound of something good being made. Bridget came through the front door at 6:52. I know the time because I had just reduced the burner to low and was reaching for the ladle when her keys landed on the entry table. She came into the kitchen without shedding her coat, which told me her day had been the kind where even small tasks feel like too much to ask. She looked at the pot. She looked at me. Then at the stovetop, where a thin film of condensation had gathered on the surrounding surface the way it always does when something has been going slowly for a long time. "This whole kitchen smells like a hospital waiting room," she said. "It's beef and vegetable soup," I said. "It'll be ready in 10 minutes. She pulled open the cabinet beside the stove, took down a glass, filled it at the sink, drank with her back to me, then set it down hard enough to make it ring against the counter. "I don't want it anymore," she said. "I want you to clean this up and stay out of the kitchen for the rest of the night. I have a headache." I set the ladle across the rim of the pot. "Bridget," I said, keeping my voice level, "I've been standing on a broken leg for 2 hours making this. Declan hasn't eaten since lunch." She turned around. Her face had settled into what I had come to think of as her final expression, the one that appeared when she had already decided the conversation was over and was waiting for me to catch up to that fact. "Declan can have cereal," she said. "You can do as you like, but I want you out of my kitchen." "It's not your kitchen," I said. The room changed. Not in any loud or dramatic way. It simply changed the way a room changes when something true gets said aloud for the first time, and everyone present understands that it can't be unsaid. Bridget took 3 steps toward me. She was a tall woman, and she wielded her height the way some people wield their voice as a form of pressure. She stopped close enough that I could watch the precise moment her expression moved from cold to something that lived below cold. Then she put the flat of her palm against the pot handle and shoved. The soup lurched sideways. Not all of it. The pot was heavy and stayed on the burner, but enough. A surge of broth, still at a full simmer, sluiced across the stovetop and broke over my right hand, where it lay against the counter's edge. I yanked back, knocked the crutch sideways, seized the counter with both hands to keep from going down, and the burn spread from my knuckles down 2 fingers with a heat that turned the edges of my vision white. I heard the front door open, Colin's keys on the entry table. He filled the kitchen doorway still in his jacket and absorbed the scene the way he always absorbed scenes involving his wife and his father, fast selectively, with his conclusions already formed before he had gathered the full picture. He took in Bridget. He took in me gripping the counter with a scorched hand and a crutch lying sideways on the floor. He looked at the soup. "What happened?" he said. "Your father," Bridget said, her voice back to its flat, uninflected register, "knocked the soup. I asked him to clean it up, and he refused." Colin looked at me. I opened my mouth. "Dad," he said before I had shaped a single word. "Just clean it up, please. Can we not do this tonight?" "Colin," I said. She burned my hand. He exhaled through his nose, long, deliberate, the breath of a man managing something that bores him. Then he looked at me with an expression I had never encountered on my son's face. Not anger, something worse. Indifference wearing the clothes of fatigue. "You've been a burden," he said, "since the day Mom died. She was the only reason I let you be part of this family." I did not move. The burn pulsed with every beat of my heart. Outside, Loretta Braden knocked twice on the front door and called in to ask if everything was all right. Colin walked to the door, and I heard him say everything was fine, thanks, good night. The door closed. I looked up at the corner above the refrigerator. The small device sat in its housing, its indicator light, burning a steady, quiet green. It had been recording for 4 months. I ran cold water over my hand at the kitchen sink for 7 minutes. Not by design, just because the mind gropes for something it can count when everything else has come apart. The burn covered the back of my right hand, from the knuckle of my index finger to just below my wrist, red and taut, already beginning to blister along one edge. I stood at the tap and breathed through my nose and looked at the window above the sink, which gave me back nothing but my own reflection against the darkness outside. Bridget had gone upstairs. I could track her movement in the footsteps crossing the ceiling above me, the specific rhythm of someone who has declared the evening finished and left whatever remains of it to someone else. Colin had not come back into the kitchen. The television murmured from the living room, a sports recap at the volume that says, "I am present but not available." I turned off the tap. I dried my hand with a dish towel, which hurt more than I had braced for. I stood for a moment in that kitchen, with the soup still on the stove, and the light still burning, and the house settling into the sounds it makes when it assumes no one is paying close attention. Then I lifted my crutch from the floor, hooked it under my arm, and moved down the hall toward the guest room. The bag was on the closet floor behind the spare blanket Rosalind had quilted the winter before she got sick. It was a waxed canvas duffel, navy blue, the kind built to last, because it came from a time when things were made to. I had packed it 3 days earlier on a Thursday afternoon, while Bridget was at work, and Declan was at school, and Colin was at his office pretending his company was solvent. I hadn't taken much: 2 changes of clothes, my shaving kit, the folder of documents I had been quietly assembling over 2 months, the deed to the house on Birchwood Street, the trust account statements, the letter from the county assessor's office regarding the Birchwood Street property that I had been redirecting to a post office box in Chula Vista, since August, my phone charger and a photograph of Rosalind from the summer we drove up the coast to Carmel and ate clam chowder out of bread bowls on a bench above the water. In the photograph, she was laughing, head tilted back, one hand, catching her hair before the wind could take it across her face. I slipped the photograph into the front pocket of the bag where I could reach it without disturbing everything packed beneath. Then I sat on the edge of the guest bed, my burned hand pressed to my chest, and let myself go still for a moment. Not thinking, not planning. Just there in that room with the quilt and the lamp and the faint trace of wood shavings that had somehow found me even in this house, a house that had never held a workshop in its life. I turned over what Colin had said. For months I had been telling myself he was weak, that weakness accounted for all of it. The eyes that never quite met mine, the reflexive deference, the reliable choice of whatever path asked the least of him. Weakness I could have made sense of. Weakness was something I had quietly in some private corner of myself expected him to leave behind as he grew. But what he had said in that kitchen wasn't weakness. It was a conclusion he had arrived at before that moment, something he had held up to the light and decided was sound. A person doesn't speak a thing like that without having already believed it. I got to my feet. I put my jacket on. I lifted the bag. The hallway was dark, except for the ribbon of light along the bottom of Declan's door at the far end. I could just make out very faintly the soft hush of his small sound machine. A white noise device shaped like a hedgehog that had sat on his nightstand since he was 4 years old. A gift from Rosalind the Christmas before her diagnosis. I stopped outside his door and pressed my palm flat against the wood just for a moment, the way I press my hand against timber to feel what is true inside it. I was turning toward the front door when his door swung open. Declan stood in the doorway in his pajamas, the ones with the small dinosaurs on them, the ones he had informed me with great seriousness were scientifically inaccurate, because real dinosaurs did not look quite like that. His hair was crushed flat on one side from the pillow. He blinked at me in the hallway light, at the bag on my shoulder, at my jacket. He didn't ask where I was going. He was 8 years old, and he had come to understand more than any 8-year-old should ever have to. He crossed the hallway in 4 steps and put both arms around my middle and pressed his face hard against my chest, and I felt his small shoulders rise and fall on a breath that was working very hard not to become something more than a breath. I put my free arm around him and held on. After a moment, he said into my jacket, "Grandpa, I put your wooden box in my backpack, so you know I kept it." My chest did something I am not going to attempt to describe any more precisely than that. I held him another moment. Then I crouched down on my good leg, so we were face to face, which cost me considerably, and I studied him in the dim hallway light. His eyes were bright and dry. He was holding himself together with the particular quiet dignity children find in themselves when they have decided the adult in front of them needs them to. I told him it was made for him. He gave one slow, serious nod. I straightened and pressed my lips to the top of his head. "Grandpa loves you more than any piece of wood I have ever made," I told him, which is saying something, because some of those pieces I had loved quite a lot. He almost smiled. Almost. I turned, walked to the front door, opened it quietly, and stepped out into the November air, which met my face sharp and cold and real. I didn't look back. The cold felt like something I'd earned. One good hand, one good leg, a navy blue bag, and a folder of documents that held the foundation of everything about to happen. I had a plane to catch. The ticket was $62. One-way San Diego County to Los Angeles, first departure at 5:45 in the morning. I had bought it on a Thursday evening in September, at a corner table in the Chula Vista Public Library, on a computer that wasn't mine, logged into an email account. Bridget had no knowledge of using a debit card, tied to an account I had opened quietly at a branch 2 towns over in the weeks after I found what was inside her desk drawer. $62, the best money I ever spent. The airport was nearly empty at that hour. My cast slowed the security line more than it should have, and a young TSA officer with a patient face guided me through secondary screening without once making me feel like a burden, which I was more grateful for than I let on. I found a seat at the gate and settled there with the bag across my lap, and my burned hand wrapped in gauze taped over it from the first aid kit in the guest bathroom. And I watched the tarmac shift from black to gray to that particular thin gold that Southern California mornings carry when the marine layer has stayed out to sea. I called Colette from the gate. She answered on the second ring, which told me she had been awake. Colette is 60 years old and has slept like a soldier her whole life. She does not surface before 6 unless something has hauled her up and kept her there. "Len," she said, and the way she said it told me she already knew something had broken. "I'm at the airport," I said. "I'm coming to Los Angeles." A pause. "How bad?" "Bad enough," I said. "But I'm all right. There's something I need to tell you first, though, about your phone calls." I told her what I had worked out. That Colin had borrowed my phone in September. That her number had been blocked. That for nearly 2 months she had been calling into silence while I sat in that house wondering why she had gone quiet. The pause that followed was not empty. It was the silence of someone absorbing a thing and deciding what form their anger would take. "But I called every single day," she said, her voice very controlled, which for Colette means she is furious. "Every day, Len." It went straight to a recording that said the number was unavailable. "I thought you were—" I didn't know what to think. "I know," I said. "I'm sorry. I didn't know." "Don't you apologize to me?" she said, sharp and immediate. "You have nothing to apologize for. You tell me what you need." That was Colette. 37 years of being my younger sister had equipped her with the ability to move from grief to logistics in roughly 4 seconds, exactly the kind of sister you want when things come apart. I told her I had an appointment that morning in Century City with an attorney named Franklin Dempsey, a family and estate law specialist I had found through a referral from Alton Strick's son-in-law, who had used him in a property dispute 2 years earlier. I told her I had a folder of documents in the bag I had been assembling since September. I told her about the deed, the trust statements, the assessor's letter. I told her about the camera. Another silence, shorter this time. "Ah, Leonard Vance," she said. "You have been sitting in that house for 5 months playing possum. I've been waiting until I had enough." "And do you have enough?" "I think so," I said. "Franklin will tell me for certain." The flight was 40 minutes. I spent most of it with my eyes shut, my hand throbbing, and the photograph of Rosalind at Carmel pressed between 2 pages of the document folder on my lap, like a bookmark. I didn't sleep. I thought about the morning she told me the diagnosis, the quality of the light in that hospital parking lot, the way her hand had closed around my sleeve. I thought about how she had spent 38 years making every room she entered a little warmer than it had been before she walked in, and how a house full of people had managed to reduce me to furniture, and how both of those things lived inside me at the same time, without one ever canceling the other out. Franklin Dempsey kept an office on the 19th floor of a building in Century City that looked out across a wide reach of West Los Angeles toward the water. He was 63, lean and unhurried, with the kind of manner that conveys competence without once announcing it. He shook my hand carefully when he noticed the gauze and asked nothing about it until I brought it up myself. I laid the documents out on his desk one at a time, the deed to Colin's house on Larkspur Lane, which listed Leonard James Vance as sole title holder, the trust account statements, the assessor's notification on the Birchwood Street property, carrying a projected compensation figure of $1.2 million under the county's commercial rezoning initiative. The camera system log-in credentials out of Dr. Merritt's practice. Franklin gave each document the time it required, no more, no less, which is the sign of a reader who is after meaning, not reassurance. He finished, aligned them into a tidy stack, laced his fingers across the top, and raised his eyes to mine. "Mr. Vance," he said, "you don't just have a case. You have leverage most people in your situation never get to hold." "I know," I said. "I've been building it since September." He eased back an inch. "What is it you want to accomplish?" 2 months I had been sitting with that question. I had worked it the way I work a board before the blade touches it, turning it end for end, reading where the grain runs, pressing for what is sound and what is not. I knew the answer down to its particulars. I laid it out for him. He let me finish without a word, and that silence told me I had the right man. He gave one nod when I was done. "Then let's begin." The hotel room was small and clean and cost $94 a night, which seemed a fair price for a heater that worked and a bathroom door with a latch that caught. I had picked the place because it was 6 blocks from Franklin's office, and because the clerk at the front counter had clocked my crutch and the gauze on my hand, and found nothing about either worth remarking on, which was precisely the variety of human decency I was in need of that night. I lowered myself onto the edge of the mattress, burned hand across my knee, document folder propped on the nightstand, and searched my memory for the last occasion I had occupied a room that belonged to no one's agenda but my own. My mind went to Colin, not the Colin from that kitchen, not the one who had stood there and said what he said about his mother. The earlier one. The version that had existed before I came to understand that a man can carry 2 entirely different selves without either one canceling the other out. He was 9 years old the summer I put a handplane in his grip, a Saturday morning, just the pair of us out to the workshop. I had positioned him at the low bench I built, with that exact use in mind, a height where a boy's feet stayed flat on the floor, because I had long held that stools were where the injuries started. Piece of soft pine, a quick lesson on angle pressure and grain direction. He absorbed it with the kind of whole, undefended attention that belongs to children before they acquire the habit of mimicking interest, rather than genuinely feeling it. First clean pass. He pulled the plane back and stared at what it had left behind, a ribbon of wood, fine enough to see light through, curling off the blade like something alive, and said, Dad, look at that." "I see it," I said. "Did I do that?" "You did that," I said. He raised the shaving up to the window and held it there while the light passed through. Neither of us moved for a while. I kept my mouth shut because nothing I could have added would have improved the moment. That was the child I had raised and known. I had to keep that picture walled off from everything else because letting them touch would have opened a grief I had no space for yet. 3 years back, I had tried a direct approach, offering Colin money outright. His company at the time was a small logistics software operation he and 2 partners had built up in Chula Vista, and it had begun showing the strain I knew from my own lean years' invoices that didn't reconcile vendors being paid at the last possible hour his name for the business, dropping out of his conversation entirely, which told me it had traveled from pride to burden. I floated the idea of a loan at Sunday dinner. Simple terms, no theater. The sort of thing fathers and sons settle between themselves when there's mutual trust at the table. He looked across at me and replied with a measured patience that stopped just short of talking down to me. Dad, I don't need you to bail me out. I've got it handled." Rosalind's gaze found mine across the table. The small, nearly invisible shake of her head carried a clear message: stand down, and after 38 years I had the translation memorized. I obeyed it without a flicker, so I stood down, and then I went around. A former apprentice of mine, a young man by the name of Cody Fenwick, had spent 2 years in my shop learning the trade before redirecting himself into finance. Out of Pasadena, he ran a modest private fund that took quiet minority positions in early-stage ventures. I rang Cody that spring, spelled out what I needed, and left the reasons out of it. He grasped the contours of the thing without requiring an explanation. That was the sort of man he was. For the 3 years following, I moved money on a quarterly basis out of my woodworking royalty account. I had held the licensing rights to 3 furniture designs that a manufacturer in Oregon had been running under my name since 2008 and into Cody's fund, which then routed it as operating capital into Collins' company through a structure that read on Collins' books as an anonymous institutional backer. Colin had no idea. Neither did his partners. The company kept its doors open. Cody sent quarterly reports that I read filed away and mentioned to nobody. Over those 3 years, the total reached just under $74,000. I want to say plainly that I did not do this as a chip to cash later. I can see how the sequence of events might suggest otherwise, that each generous act was another layer of a trap I was quietly constructing. That reading is wrong. I did what I did because the man was my son. His enterprise was sinking, I had resources he lacked, and his pride made a direct rescue impossible. Nothing more than that. Howie rang at 9 that evening. I had given him no address, no city, nothing. He had pieced it together regardless the way Howie pieces most things together, by attending carefully to the gaps in what I had last said to him. "You did it," he said. A statement, not a query. "I did it," I said. Silence for a beat. Then Howe said, "How's the hand?" "Blistered," I said. "Bandaged. Want me to make the drive up?" "Not yet," I told him. "But soon, Howie. I'm going to need something from you." "Len," he said, his voice carrying the particular low warmth that surfaced when he'd been holding a thought for a while. 33 years in, it's not a favor. You know what it is." I told him I knew. 2 days, I said, and I'd call. I set the phone beside the document folder and the photograph of Rosalind, and sat without moving in the quiet of that room, letting the full mass of what I was about to do settle onto me just for a moment. Then the lamp went off and I stretched out and let my eyes close. Sleep wasn't deep, but it came. I surfaced at 5:43 without any alarm, the same as most mornings of my grown life, my body having arrived long ago at the conclusion that lying past 6 was idleness it wanted no part of. Los Angeles morning pressed in through the curtain gap as a thin gray thread of light, and I stayed still, running my mental checklist burned, hand-throbbing, leg-stiff document folder on the nightstand $62 ticket stub, tucked into the front pocket of the bag. Everything where it should be. I had Franklin at 9. 2 hours and 15 minutes to work with. I got coffee going on the little dresser machine, moved to the window chair, and let the city below gradually become itself in the early light. And my mind went back to the Wednesday in September that had set everything else in motion. Not the soup incident. That was the match. The September Wednesday was the moment I made up my mind. The whole thing started because I was hunting for a pen, which in hindsight carries an almost absurd quality that 3 years of concealment began unraveling over something that small. I had been seated at the kitchen table working through a form Declan's school had sent home, an emergency contact update tucked into his backpack by his teacher, and my pen gave out before I was halfway done. Bridget's desk occupied the little alcove off the hallway, her home office. She was at work. 4 months I had been living in that house, and it did not cross my mind to hesitate before sliding open the top drawer to find something to write with. What I was about to learn about what had quietly been arranged behind my back, and by whom, would change the shape of everything that followed. Before we get there, tell me if you discovered that someone close to you had been planning against you in secret. Would you confront them directly, or would you take your time and let the evidence do the talking? The pen was right there next to a small stapler and a box of paper clips. I took it and then, because the drawer was still open, and the document sitting on top of the stack inside it had my name on it. 4 pages printed and clipped together, laid out with the kind of precise formatting that comes from a legal template rather than anything composed from scratch. At the top, in a clean serif font, power of attorney and care compensation agreement. Below that, in slightly smaller text, Leonard James Vance, grantor. I stood at that desk with the pen in my hand and the drawer open and the whole house silent around me. Then I lowered myself into Bridget's chair and read every word. The document was structured as a voluntary caregiving agreement, a legitimate legal instrument under California law that allows a family member who provides care to an elderly relative to receive compensation drawn from that relative's income or assets. There is nothing inherently wrong with such arrangements. Families use them in good faith all the time. What set this one apart was the precision of what it asked for. It proposed to assign to Bridget Vance as primary caregiver a monthly payment equal to 80% of Leonard James Vance's combined Social Security benefit and disability supplement, which at the figures then current came to just over $3,100 per month in exchange for room board and caregiving services provided within the home. There was also a clause extending to Bridget limited power of attorney over Leonard's financial accounts for the specific purpose of processing these payments directly. The grantor signature line at the bottom sat empty, dated 2 weeks from that day. I read through it twice. Then I went through it a third time, the way I read a board 3 times before the first cut, to make sure I've seen what is actually there and not just what I came in expecting. She had not shown it to Colin. I was sure of that without any evidence to point to, because I knew my son well enough to understand that even at his worst, he would have pulled back from something this nakedly explicit. This had been drafted by Bridget on her own or with help she had kept to herself. It was a plan with a timetable and a signature line waiting to be filled. I carried the document to the kitchen and photographed each page on my phone with the flash off so there would be no change in the light on the window if anyone happened to glance in from outside. Then I walked it back to the drawer, reclipped exactly as I had found it, pen on top, stapler to the left, box of paper clips to the right. I shut the drawer. I returned to the kitchen table, finished filling in Declan's emergency contact form with Bridget's pen, and slipped it back into his backpack for the morning. That evening, I drove to the Chula Vista Public Library. I settled at a corner terminal, pulled up the email account I had set up 2 months earlier under a name not my own, and composed a detailed message to myself at a second account laying out everything I had seen, the specific terms, the monthly figures, the power of attorney clause, the date on the signature line. I sent it, cleared the browser history, and drove home and made dinner. The following morning, I called Franklin Dempsey for the first time. I had his name from Alton Strick's son-in-law, as I had told Colette at the airport, but I had been sitting on that referral for 6 weeks, turning it in my hands, not quite prepared to make the call that would move what I was living through from a family trouble into something with legal dimensions. The document in the drawer made me prepared. Franklin listened for 22 minutes without a word. When I was done, he said, "Mr. Vance, I want you to come in at your earliest convenience. Bring everything you have." I told him I would need a few weeks to finish putting together what he would need. He said to take what time was necessary, but no more than that. I understood the implication. That same evening, I bought the plane ticket. One way, $62. I had no fixed date in mind. I only knew that when the night came, I would be ready. I had been ready from the moment I slid that drawer shut. They called it the old place. That was Colin's phrase, delivered with the offhand dismissiveness of someone who has decided a thing holds no value and therefore merits no further thought. The old place, like it was a broken appliance I had forgotten to dispose of, something embarrassing, parked at the end of a driveway, waiting on a bulk trash pickup that kept not coming. The house on Birchwood Street was a 1953 ranch style on a corner lot, in what had been, when Rosalind and I bought it in 1986, a quiet working neighborhood of modest yards and shared fence lines and neighbors who showed up with food when someone was ill. We paid $91,000 for it. We painted it ourselves over a long weekend in April, windows open, radio on, Rosalind in her father's old flannel shirt with paint in her hair, laughing at something I had said that I can no longer bring back to mind, but can still hear her laughing at. We raised Colin in that house. I built the bookshelves in his bedroom, the window seat in the living room, the kitchen cabinets that Rosalind said made the whole room feel like it belonged to people who actually knew what they were about. When Colin left at 24, we stayed. When the workshop outgrew the garage, I rented a space nearby and held on to the house. After Rosalind died, I held on still because it was the last place in the world that carried her touch. Colin had raised the subject of selling twice in the 2 years before I moved in with him, the first time over. The phone framed as a practical concern, the upkeep, the taxes, the fact that I was out there alone and the neighborhood had shifted. The second time was at dinner, 3 months after I'd moved in, with Bridget seated beside him, nodding at measured intervals the way she nodded when she had already settled the outcome of a conversation and was simply waiting for it to catch up. You could probably get $350, maybe $400 for it, Colin said. Not a great return, but it would simplify things. Simplify things the way people say it, when what they mean is simplify things for me. I told him I wasn't ready to sell. He nodded and moved on to something else, and I watched Bridget's expression hold just a beat too long before she reached for her water glass, which told me the conversation hadn't ended, only relocated somewhere I wasn't invited. What neither of them knew was that I had received a letter in August from the San Diego County Assessor's Office, forwarded from the Birchwood Street address to a post office box in Chula Vista that I had quietly maintained for years, a place I kept for financial correspondence I preferred to handle separately. The letter informed me that the Birchwood Street property fell within a newly designated commercial development corridor under the county's updated general plan, and that the city was initiating eminent domain proceedings to acquire parcels within that corridor for a mixed-use transit and retail development project. Eminent domain is the legal authority by which a government entity can compel the sale of private property for public use, provided the owner receives just compensation, fair market value, as determined by independent appraisal. The letter included a preliminary compensation estimate derived from current comparable sales and the property's assessed value. The figure on the page was $1.2 million. I sat with that letter for a long time at the kitchen table on Birchwood Street, which I had driven out to alone that Saturday, on the pretext of checking the pipes before winter. The house was still and quiet, carrying the faint smell of lemon oil from the last time I had worked the cabinets. Late afternoon light came through the living room window and laid a rectangle on the floor that moved slowly toward the wall while I read the number again and thought about the weekend Rosalind and I had painted that very room 2 full days because we kept breaking off to disagree amiably about whether the color ran too yellow, then agreeing each time that it was exactly right. 1.2 million. I rang Colette that evening and told her about the letter. A pause on her end. Then, "Leonard, does Colin know?" "No," I said, "and I'd prefer to keep it that way for now." Another pause. "How long have you had this?" 3 weeks, I said. "And you've just been sitting on it?" "I've been thinking," I said. Colette made a sound somewhere short of a laugh. "Len, you don't think, you build. There's a difference." She meant it mostly as a joke. But she wasn't entirely wrong. I asked her to be listed as secondary contact on the assessor's correspondence going forward, so that any follow-up materials would reach her directly if something happened to the post office box. She agreed without asking for a reason, which was one of the things that made her someone I trusted with matters I shared with almost no one. I also asked her to hold on to a sealed envelope I would send that week, a copy of the deed, the assessor's letter, and a 3-page summary I had written out by hand, explaining where the property stood and what I intended to do with it. "Open it only when I ask you to," I told her, "or if something keeps me from asking." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Len, how bad is it over there?" I looked at the rectangle of afternoon light on the living room floor. It had moved all the way to the baseboard. Rosalind had painted that baseboard herself, with a fine brush cutting a line so clean she called me in to see it when she finished. She was proud of it. "It's manageable," I said. "For now." "You call me," she said. "The moment it stops being manageable, you call me." "I will," I said. I drove back to Colin's house that evening in time to get dinner started. Nobody asked where I'd been. That was the thing about becoming invisible, it had its uses right up until it didn't. On the third morning after I left, I put on the one good shirt I had packed, drank the hotel coffee standing at the window, and walked the 6 blocks to Franklin's office, crutch on the left document folder under my right arm. Burned hand, still wrapped in the fresh gauze Colette had brought over the previous evening, along with a container of beef and vegetable soup she had made herself. I ate it cold at the desk, because I didn't want to stop working long enough to heat it. Franklin had 3 documents waiting when I arrived. He walked me through each one with the same unhurried precision I had come to recognize as simply how he worked. Not slow, but complete the way a good carpenter measures twice before the blade touches wood, because the wood does not forgive a hurried hand. The first was a formal notice of title assertion establishing on the public record that Leonard James Vance held sole title to the property at 1422 Larkspur Lane, San Diego County, California, the house where Colin and Bridget were currently living. As sole title holder, I had the legal right to initiate a sale to require the occupants to vacate or to take any other action a property owner is entitled to take under California law. Franklin noted that because Colin had no ownership interest in the property, his name had never been placed on the title, a decision I had made quietly and deliberately 5 years ago when I had paid the bulk of the purchase price and arranged the financing. He had no legal standing to contest whatever I chose to do with it. The second document was a written notice to the lending institution carrying the mortgage on the Larkspur Lane property, informing them that I, as guarantor of record on Colin's original loan application, was terminating my guarantor obligations with respect to any future credit extensions or restructured debt. Franklin was careful to draw the boundary. A guarantor cannot walk back obligations already on the books, but he can formally put the lender on notice that he will bear no responsibility for anything new going forward. The practical result, Franklin said, was that the bank would be obliged to reassess Colin's creditworthiness on his own, which, given the current condition of his company's finances, was unlikely to produce an encouraging picture. I signed both documents. My hand ached. I signed anyway. The third document was a letter to the San Diego County Superior Court requesting a protective order hearing grounded in the events of November 14th, the burn, the physical contact, the documented pattern of conduct recorded by the medical monitoring camera. Franklin had already submitted the camera footage to the court, directly using the login credentials I had provided. He said the footage was clear, the audio was clear, and the court would have no trouble grasping what it showed. I nodded. I asked how long before Colin and Bridget would be notified of the various actions underway. The bank would reach Colin within 48 hours of receiving our notice, Franklin said. The title assertion would become public record by end of week. The protective order hearing notice would go to both of them simultaneously, likely within the week as well. And the camera footage, I said they'll see it. Their attorneys would receive copies as part of discovery, he said. Yes. I sat with that for a moment. I thought about Bridget standing in that kitchen, sure of her own footing, the way people are sure when nothing has ever come back around to find them. I thought about Colin in the doorway looking at his father on the floor beside a knocked pot of soup and choosing the option that cost him nothing. All right, I said. File everything. The call from Colin came at 4:17 that afternoon. I was in a coffee shop 2 blocks from the hotel, a cup in front of me that I hadn't touched. Turning Franklin's business card over in my fingers for 20 minutes, without noticing I was doing it. My phone moved on the table and Colin's name was on the screen. I let it ring 3 full times before I picked up. Dad. His voice was taut in a way I hadn't heard since the year his company first nearly went under before Cody Fenwick's fund had quietly put it back on its feet. Dad, I got a call from the bank. They're saying our guarantor status has been... They're saying there's some kind of change to the loan structure. What did you do? See, I notified them of a change to my guarantor obligations. You can't just, Dad, that's our house. That's where we live. It's my house, Colin, I said. It has always been my house. You have known that since the day I paid for it. A silence that held no comfort. Then his voice dropped and shifted into something I recognized, the register he fell into when the approach he had prepared wasn't landing and he needed a moment to come at it from another direction. Dad, whatever happened the other night, whatever you think happened, we can talk about this. You don't have to do this. Bridget is upset. She's willing to apologize. We can sit down. Colin, I said. I want you to listen to me carefully. I am not doing this because I am upset. I am not doing this because of one night. I am doing this because of 3 years, and because I have documentation of all of it, and because a court is going to see that documentation very soon. I paused. You should speak with an attorney. He started to say something else. I told him I had to go and ended the call. Bridget called 4 minutes later. Her voice was soft and measured in a way it had never been in 3 years of knowing me, which told me exactly how frightened she had become in the past 4 hours. I listened for 11 seconds. Then I set the phone face down on the table and picked up my coffee and found it had gone entirely cold. I drank it anyway. Cold coffee in a quiet shop 6 blocks from a hotel room that was mine alone burned hand-signed documents and the particular stillness of a man who has finally stopped waiting. Howie Mabry has a workshop behind his house in El Cajon that carries the smell of cedar and machine oil and the kind of fine sawdust that settles into corners no broom ever quite reaches. He has worked in that shop for 31 years. And over that time, he has built a web of friendships with woodworkers and small furniture makers across San Diego County that functions less like a professional network and more like a neighborhood, the kind where people keep an eye out for each other without being asked and remember favors without running tallies. I called him on a Thursday morning from the hotel room 4 days after I had left Colin's house. I had been turning the call over for 2 days, the way I turn a problem in the workshop, approaching it from different angles, checking for the grain, making sure I knew what I was actually cutting before I put down the first mark. Howie, I said the moment he answered, I'm calling in that favor. Name it, he said. I walked him through Bridget's operation, the lifestyle blog with its 14,000 followers. The photographs, my hands, my soup, the sight of me moving through her kitchen packaged and served to an audience that had been given every reason to believe they were looking at a family held together by genuine warmth. Then the supply side, her online furniture brand, ran almost entirely on stock from 3 small workshops. Men Howie had come up alongside craftsmen who had learned their trade in the same world where Howe and I had spent our careers. They had been giving Bridget favorable terms, because she had painted a picture of growth. Let them believe substantial orders were right around the corner without ever quite committing to that in so many words. Howie took it all in without cutting across me. When I reached the end, there was a pause, not the kind that signals doubt, but the kind that belongs to a man sorting through what he already knows. Pete Morales down in National City, he said. The Decker brothers over in Escondido. Frank Ostrowski in Santee. A short exhale on my end. Those three account for maybe 80% of what she moves. Right, I said. A beat. So you're asking me to make some calls. I'm asking you to give them the truth, I said. Nothing beyond that. Tell them what went on under that roof. Tell them what she did to me. After that, what they do is their business. How went quiet? Behind him, I could pick up the ambient sounds of his shop, a fan turning wood settling in. The way it does when the air temperature shifts. Len, he said finally, those men have known you the better part of 25 years. They don't need me to explain the situation to them. What they need is for me to open the door. That's exactly what I'm asking, I said. End of day, he said. I'll have something for you. I passed that Thursday the same way I had been passing most of my days since Los Angeles, reading documents, waiting, keeping mental account of what was already done and what had yet to move. Franklin had confirmed the camera footage was in the court's hands. The title assertion had gone on to the public record. A message Franklin relayed that afternoon told me the bank had reached Colin the day before, notifying him that the loan against the Larkspur Lane property was under review, while they took a fresh look at his standing as a borrower on his own. Colin had phoned the bank 3 times. On the second call, he had asked for a supervisor. Howie rang at 4:45. All 3, he said. Done. Pete got back to me inside an hour. Mentioned he'd been looking for a natural opening to have that conversation anyway. Apparently invoices had been running 2 months late, and she'd gone quiet on a reorder she'd already committed to. He stopped for a breath. The Deckers were a different story. She'd told them a brand partnership was in the pipeline that would triple their volume, so they'd been sitting on inventory for her at cost. Finding out the partnership may not have been entirely real did not go over well. And Frank said, and I'm giving you his exact words, that he'd had a bad feeling about that whole arrangement from day one and was grateful for a reason to act on it. A brief beat. He also wanted me to pass along that the rocking chair you made him in '97 is still standing and has never once needed repair. I held that thought for a moment. 27 years, and the chair had held. Thank you, Howie, I said. Stop that, he said with the particular edge he put on words when warmth was making him restless. Tell me what comes next, I told him. I brought up Ventura not as a settled plan, more as a compass heading. The way a man knows which direction he is walking before he has decided where he will stop. A small workshop, I said. 2 years I had been turning the idea over. The unhurried kind of operation that builds things carefully for people who can tell the difference. He let me finish without breaking in, which is always how I know he is actually listening. Honestly, I've been ready to leave San Diego County for a while, he said. Eleanor's been saying the same thing. Traffic keeps getting worse. It does, I said. Property near the coast won't be cheap. I've got some money coming, I said. Howe laughed a real laugh, quick and unguarded, ahead of any decision to release it. Len Vance, he said. 30 years you have been holding on to that land, waiting for this exact moment. 37, I said. Near enough, he said. Same story either way. After we hung up, I stayed where I was, phone resting on the nightstand, afternoon light stretched in a long, pale bar across the wall, document folder squared on the desk, and the photograph of Rosalind propped where I could see it from the chair. Her head back laughing at a remark I made that has long since left me, though the sound of the laugh itself has not. I opened my Bible to the 23rd Psalm. The passage Rosalind had read aloud the morning after her diagnosis. Her voice not wavering, her hand in mine and warm. I went through it twice. Then I shut the book and sat without moving, and let everything grow quiet around me the way a workshop goes quiet after the last tool is set down, and the sawdust drifts and finally settles. The subpoena landed on a Tuesday. I know the day because Colette phoned that same afternoon, her voice carrying the particular studied neutrality she employs when she is quietly pleased about something. She told me Bridget had put up a new photograph on the blog herself, at the kitchen table, face buried in both hands, a cup of tea going cold at her elbow, with a caption that read, "Some weeks test everything you thought you knew about family. Grateful for grace and for the people who show up more soon." By the time Colette read it to me, the post had collected 412 comments. The majority ran along the lines of praying for you, or stay strong, or family is the hardest thing. 3 of them were different. Those 3 came from readers who had been following long enough to recall the earlier posts. The ones where my hands appeared at her stove, where my back was visible at her sink, where my presence in that kitchen was presented as a sign of a household that was warm and whole. Those 3 wanted to know with varying degrees of tact where the grandfather had disappeared to. Bridget left all 3 unanswered. By then, I had been 2 weeks in Los Angeles, and a routine had formed around me almost without my noticing, one that suited me better than I would have predicted. Coffee standing at the window, a walk each morning to Franklin's office or to the small park 4 blocks over where I could take a bench and give my leg a rest. Midday at a diner on Pico Boulevard, where the waitress had my order committed to memory by day 3 and set coffee in front of me before I had fully settled into my seat. Small things. My own. Franklin reached me the morning after the subpoena was served to lay out what would follow. The filing cited California Welfare and Institutions Code, Section 15610, the statute that covers abuse, neglect, and the financial exploitation of adults 65 and older. Under its terms, everything captured on that medical monitoring camera, the deliberate burn, the physical contact, the documented months of verbal degradation, met the legal definition of elder abuse under California law and exposed the responsible party to both civil and criminal liability. 30 days for her to respond, Franklin said. Her attorney will map out the choices. The likeliest first move is a push toward a private settlement. They'll try to bring this to ground before it gets any wider. And if she comes at me directly, I said, she may. Her attorney may. Either way, the moment there's personal contact, you write it down and it comes to me the same day. A pause. Leonard, do not sit down with her alone. Under no circumstances. I acknowledged that. What I kept to myself was that Bridget had already tried to reach me 4 times in the 2 days since the subpoena was delivered. 4 different numbers. 2 looked like her own cell. A third traced back to a woman named Tricia Nowlin, identified after a quick search. Colette ran as Bridget's closest friend, according to the blog's About page. The 4th came off Colin's phone, which told me the 2 of them were still coordinating closely enough to trade handsets when their own numbers went unanswered. I let every one of them go to silence. Then, on the 5th day, Bridget dialed from her own number at 2 in the afternoon, and this time she left a message. I played it once on my feet by the open window with the sounds of a Los Angeles afternoon rising from the street. Her voice was something I had not encountered in 3 years. Soft, unsteady, stripped of the composure she had never once let slip in all the time I had known her. She said she was sorry. Her voicemail said she never intended things to end up here. She said she knew what she'd done to me was wrong, that she wanted a chance to fix it, and she was pleading with me to call her so they could work something out before the attorneys took over entirely. I sent it along to Franklin without picking up the phone. He rang me back 20 minutes later, his voice carrying that deliberate, measured tone he only used when the information in his hands deserved careful handling. "Leonard," he said, straight question. "Have you had any contact with Bridget since the day you walked out?" Not a word, I told him. "Good," he said, "because her attorney just reached out to me. Apparently Bridget claims she recorded a phone call between the two of you and plans to offer it as proof of what her side is calling financial coercion." I let that sit. "We haven't spoken," I said. "No call happened. No recording exists." "I'm aware," Franklin said. "And that's precisely what's going to cause her trouble." He took a breath. "Under California law, taping a conversation without every participant's consent runs afoul of Penal Code Section 632. That's not a matter of the evidence being thrown out. It's a criminal violation. If she went ahead and recorded anyone without their knowledge and tried to use that tape in a legal proceeding, she's piled a fresh set of problems on top of everything else she's already facing." "She never recorded me," I said. "There was no conversation to record." Then, whatever she handed her attorney, Franklin said with the settled patience of someone who has watched nearly every kind of human miscalculation play out, is either something she invented or a recording of somebody else that she's passed off as something it isn't. A beat of silence. Whichever it is, Leonard, none of it moves her position forward. After we said goodbye, I stayed at the window a good while watching the city work through its afternoon below me. Across town somewhere, Bridget was sitting with the fallout of a scheme that had never once considered the chance that I had been watching all along, that I had never stopped watching, that a man who has spent 40 years working quietly with his hands builds a kind of patience that looks nothing like weakness from the outside, and that the distance between those two things has a way of announcing itself at precisely the moment it matters most. Loretta Braden phoned that evening to see how I was holding up, the way she had made a habit of doing every couple of days since I'd moved out. The house on Larkspur Lane was quiet, she said. Bridget's car hadn't turned up in the driveway in 2 days. Colin had been getting Declan to school himself every morning, something she'd never once seen him do in the entire 4 months I'd been living next door. "How's Declan doing?" I asked. "But he had that little backpack both days," she said. "The same one he was carrying the night you left." I told her good night and stood there in the stillness of the hotel room long after we hung up, turning over the image of a small boy with a wooden box tucked in his pack, climbing into a car his father had finally bothered to drive. The mediation session was convened on a Wednesday morning in a conference room occupying the 14th floor of a building in downtown Los Angeles. The kind of space engineered for neutrality, stripped of anything that might tip the atmosphere one way or another. Gray carpeting along table chairs ranked on both sides, a window offering a view of nothing in particular. The mediator was a woman named Nadette Quarry, a retired family court judge somewhere in her mid-60s, reading glasses hanging on a chain at her collar, wearing the expression of a person who had spent 2 decades watching parties file into rooms like this one, already certain of their version of events, and who had run out of capacity for surprise at what people chose to bring. Franklin and I took one side. Colin and Bridget settled across from us alongside their attorney, a man named Spencer Aldgate, whose suit fit him a shade too precisely for the setting, and who projected the ease of someone far more comfortable navigating around the truth than meeting it head-on. Colin kept his eyes away from me as he sat down. Bridget glanced at me once, briefly, unreadably. It wasn't the cool, calculating look I'd grown used to reading on her face. It was something else, the look of someone who has just realized the ground they're standing on was always an edge, and they only understand that now because they're already teetering. Spencer Aldgate began by framing the matter as a family disagreement that had been needlessly dragged into the legal arena when one party could simply have sought an understanding at home. He delivered this with the fluency of a man who had leaned on that same framing many times before and been rewarded for it. Nadette Quarry sat listening with her palms flat on the table and her glasses partway down her nose, taking no notes at all, which I'd learned from Franklin, was a signal that she was mapping the logic of the argument, not cataloging its particulars. Franklin set 3 documents on the table in response. First, the footage analysis produced by the forensic media firm. He'd retained a document written in the clipped exact language of people paid to leave no interpretive room, laying out with precision what the recording captured and what it ruled out. Second, the draft caregiving agreement carrying Bridget's printed name at the top, the signature line still empty. Third, the elder abuse subpoena, its relevant statutory language underlined in yellow. Spencer Aldgate studied the pages. He turned his gaze to his clients. Something gave way in the set of his shoulders, barely perceptible, the kind of micro-shift that happens to a load-bearing wall before the crack shows on the surface. Bridget turned toward him and murmured something. He dipped his head and murmured back. Then he reached into his briefcase and drew out a document of his own, several pages, held together with a clip, and positioned it on the table with the deliberate care of a man who believes he is producing his ace. My client wishes to introduce a communication demonstrating that these very proceedings were in fact anticipated and actively welcomed by Mr. Vance himself as a mechanism for exerting financial pressure on his own son. Specifically, Spencer Aldgate continued a text exchange between Mr. Vance and his son Colin, which establishes a prior understanding between them regarding the family's financial arrangements. Nadette Quarry looked at the document. She looked at Franklin, then at me. Franklin lifted the printed sheets and read through them. He read at a deliberate pace which told me everything I needed to know. What was on those pages was not what Spencer Aldgate thought it was. He finished, set them flat on the table, and nudged the stack toward the center. Then he turned his attention to Bridget, the steady, unhurried attention of a man who has just received something far more valuable than the person who gave it ever realized. "Mrs. Vance," Franklin said, his voice low and even, "would you tell the room how you came to have these messages?" Bridget sat up slightly. "They were on Colin's phone," she said. "I saved them a few months back, and you gave them to your attorney to support your case in these proceedings." "That's correct." Franklin gave a single nod. Then he turned the pages toward Nadette Quarry so she could read them for herself. I hadn't laid eyes on those messages before that morning. I read them from my side of the table, leaning in the flat gray Los Angeles light filtering through the window at Bridget's back. The exchange was between Colin and Bridget, not between Colin and me. The date on it was 14 months earlier, right around the period following Rosalind's death, close to when Colin had placed the call asking me to come and stay. Colin's messages read, "If we bring Dad in now while he's grieving, he won't push back. We can use his pension for the household expenses, and he can watch Declan and handle the house. He'll think he's helping. He won't ask questions." Bridget's reply was one word: perfect. No one raised their voice. There was no need. Nadette Quarry went through the messages twice, then lowered the pages onto the table with the particular care of someone making sure they understand exactly what they are looking at before they decide what to do about it. Spencer Aldgate sat motionless in his chair. Colin stared down at the table surface, studying the wood grain with the concentration of a man who has decided that is the only safe place to look. Bridget turned to her attorney. Spencer Aldgate did not turn back. I looked across at my son. He felt my eyes and lifted his, and for a long moment we held each other's gaze across that gray table in that carefully neutral room. And for the first time in 35 years of being his father, I did not know the person looking back at me. Not because he had turned into someone unfamiliar, but because I was finally allowing myself to see with full clarity who he had always been and how long I had refused to look. Franklin spoke, his voice entirely level. Mrs. Vance, in submitting this exchange, you have placed into evidence a document that names your husband as the chief architect of the very conduct these proceedings exist to address. I want to be certain that you and your attorney have fully absorbed that before we go any further. Spencer Aldgate asked for a 10-minute recess. Nadette Quarry granted it without changing her expression. Colin said nothing during that break. He sat where he was, hands resting on the table, and I watched him from across the room. I thought about the boy who had once held a curl of pine up to the workshop window just to watch the light push through it, and about the man who had typed the word perfect into a phone and pressed send, and about the gulf between those two versions of the same person, a gulf I had not created but had refused to see until it had quietly become the whole of the landscape. When they reconvened, Spencer Aldgate announced that his clients wished to explore a settlement framework. Nadette Quarry peered at me over the top of her glasses. I gave Franklin a small nod. He opened his folder and began. The mediation session ran for 3 hours and 40 minutes. I won't walk you through every exchange at that table because most of what happened was the kind of negotiation that wears the clothing of conversation while actually being arithmetic. Franklin advancing figures and positions. Spencer Aldgate giving ground on them in small, reluctant increments. Nadette Quarry tracking the shrinking distance between the two sides with the patience of someone who has watched this particular geometry resolve itself many times over and is simply holding her place until the parties reach the destination she has already mapped. What I will say is that by the time we rose to leave, Spencer Aldgate had requested 2 weeks to take the settlement framework Franklin had outlined back to his clients. Nadette Quarry had granted it, and Bridget had not offered a single unprompted word in the final 90 minutes of the session. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, her eyes cast down at the table. The careful composure of a woman who had understood somewhere in the preceding hour that the room was not configured to her advantage and would not reconfigure itself on her behalf. Colin said one thing as we were gathering our things to leave. He looked up from across the table, and his face carried the particular exhaustion of someone who has been bracing against something for a long time and has finally run out of the will to keep bracing. He said, "Dad, I didn't think it would go this far." I held his gaze for a moment. Then I said, "I know you didn't, Colin." I picked up my folder and walked out behind Franklin. We talked through the session in the elevator on the way down. Franklin said the day had gone about as well as it reasonably could, and that Spencer Aldgate was a capable enough attorney who would now sit down with his clients and give them an honest read of where they stood, which was not on solid ground. He said the 2-week window was in his judgment more likely to produce a settlement offer than a decision to push toward litigation because the camera footage alone made litigation a deeply uncomfortable prospect for anyone sitting on that side of the table. He said I should rest and let the process move. I told him I would try. Colette phoned that evening. She had spoken with Loretta, who had been at her kitchen window that afternoon when Colin and Bridget came back from the mediation. Loretta had watched them pull into the driveway separately. Colin first in his car, Bridget arriving 12 minutes behind him in hers, which told Colette something about how the ride back from downtown Los Angeles had gone. Loretta said Colin had gone inside without waiting. Bridget had stayed in her car in the driveway for 11 minutes before she went in. The next morning, Loretta called me directly at 7:15. "Leonard," she said, and her voice had that careful, deliberate quality of someone reporting something she has seen with her own eyes and is weighing every word before she speaks it. "I needed to tell you something that happened last night." She said that at around 9:45 she had heard raised voices from the house next door. Not enough to make out words from that distance, but the unmistakable rhythm of two people locked in the specific kind of argument that has stopped caring about who might hear. She said it went on for roughly 20 minutes and ended with a door slamming hard enough to rattle the glass in her kitchen window. She said that at 10:35, Bridget had come out the front door with a bag on her shoulder, gotten into her car, and driven off, and had not come back by the time Loretta went to bed at midnight. Colette called me an hour after Loretta. Through a mutual friend who moved in overlapping circles with Bridget, she had learned that Bridget had driven to Tricia Nolan's house the previous night, and that the two of them had been on the phone with Bridget's mother in Phoenix for most of those hours. She also said Colin had called his mother's cousin in Riverside at some point that same evening, which Colette found notable because Colin hadn't spoken to that cousin in at least 4 years. They're both making calls, Colette said, laying the groundwork for separate camps. I know, I said. Len, are you surprised I thought about it honestly? A marriage built around a shared undertaking. The undertaking of extracting something from a person who trusted them tends to hold two people together only for as long as the extraction remains viable. The moment it collapses, there is nothing beneath the surface to keep them facing the same direction. I had understood this in theory for a while. Watching it happen in front of me was a different matter, not exactly satisfying. More like watching a structure you had framed badly finally give way the way physics always meant it to, inevitable, and without any particular drama. No, I said. I'm not surprised. I'm just tired. Colette was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Al, I'm coming down next week. I'm going to cook you a real dinner, and we are going to sit at a table and eat it like human beings, and you are going to tell me about Ventura. There's not much to tell yet, I said. Then we'll plan, she said. That's what you do when there's not much to tell yet. You plan. Franklin called that afternoon with 2 pieces of news. The first was that the San Diego County Assessor's Office had formally confirmed the compensation figure on the Birchwood Street property, and that the paperwork initiating the check was working its way through the county process on schedule $1.2 million into an account, carrying only my name arriving in the new year. The second was that Spencer Aldgate had phoned Franklin that morning, 3 days ahead of the 2-week window, to say his clients were ready to discuss settlement terms in earnest. Franklin said that, in his experience, attorneys who called ahead of schedule were representing clients who had done the arithmetic and found the result unpleasant. I asked Franklin what he thought we ought to ask for. He told me. I listened carefully, the way I listen when someone who knows more than I do about a particular material is telling me something I need to understand before I make the first cut. When he finished, I said that sounded right, and to go ahead. That evening, I signed the paperwork confirming the Birchwood Street compensation and sat in the hotel room with the document on the desk before me, thinking about the weekend Rosalind and I had painted those walls and the afternoon light that traveled across that floor, and the baseboard trim she had cut with a small brush and called me in to look at when she was satisfied. $1.2 million. She would have laughed at that number, not with bitterness, just the genuine, uncomplicated delight she had always brought to things that turned out better than expected. Her head tilted back one hand, keeping her hair from blowing across her face. I let myself hear it for a moment. Then I picked up the phone and called Howie. There is something I want to be clear about before I tell you what came next. I did not want the house back. I want to say that plainly, because it is the kind of detail that tends to disappear when people hear a story like this one and begin sorting it into familiar categories. Winners and losers, revenge and justice, the settling of scores. I had no desire to return to 1422 Larkspur Lane. No wish to walk back through those rooms to sleep again in the guest bed, to stand at that kitchen counter beneath the corner above the refrigerator, where a small device with a green indicator light had spent 4 months recording a life I was done living. What I wanted was for the house to carry some weight, for the decision I had made 37 years ago to pay the majority of the purchase price to serve as guarantor, to put my name on the title so that my son could own a home when his own financial history made that otherwise impossible to have meant something. Not gratitude. I had given up expecting gratitude a good while back. Just acknowledgement. Just the plain recognition that what a person gives away costs something real. Early January, a Monday. I rang Franklin and gave him the word move forward with the sale. He had already made contact with a real estate firm in San Diego County, one that specialized in exactly this kind of case, selling a property from under occupants who had no legal claim to be there. He walked me through it. California required at least 30 days written notice before anyone could be compelled to vacate. That said, given everything that was documented, and the protective order proceedings running alongside the clock on that notice could start ticking immediately, concurrent with the rest of what was already in motion legally. I told him to start it. A process server Franklin arranged hand-delivered the formal paperwork to Colin and Bridget on a Wednesday morning, put it in their hands, made them sign for it. Colin signed and said nothing. Bridget wasn't home. She hadn't set foot back in the Larkspur Lane house since the night she'd driven over to Tricia Nolan's, and Franklin had no reason to think she intended to return. In every meaningful sense, the marriage was over. The legal dissolution simply hadn't been filed yet. Colin phoned me that same Wednesday evening. It was his first call since we'd all sat across that table from each other, and something in him had changed. Whatever coiled, strategic quality his voice used to carry, that constant recalibrating, it was gone. What came through instead was raw and unguarded, and I found it, against my expectations, easier to receive. "Dad," he said. 30 days. "Yes," I said. Then silence, not a tactical pause, just a man absorbing something that had weight. Where am I supposed to go? No heat in it, no blame, just the honest question of a person who had finally stopped performing and was asking straight. "I don't know, Colin," I said. "That's a question only you can answer." A beat. "Is Declan okay?" That stopped him. He went quiet, and when his voice came back, it had dropped its guard, the way a voice does when the subject has shifted from something a person is managing to something a person actually loves. "He's doing fine," Colin said. "He's been asking about you." "Tell him Grandpa is okay," I said. "Tell him I'm building something new." Silence on the line. Then, "Dad, I need you to know that I—" He broke off, tried again. "I didn't what I said that night about Mom." "I didn't, Colin," I said quietly. "Not yet. We're not there yet." He let it rest. We said goodnight and hung up. And I stayed in the hotel room, which had become across 6 weeks, as known to me as any place I'd ever lived. The parted curtains, the machine on the dresser, the chair pulled up to the window, and I turned over in my mind the difference between not yet and never. That gap matters when you are 65 years old, when the years behind you outnumber the ones ahead, and you are working out with some care what you are still willing to pick up and what you have already set down for good. Loretta called that Friday, the same day the real estate agent had scheduled a first showing of the Larkspur Lane house for interested buyers. She told me a woman in a blazer turned up at 9 with a clipboard and spent 40 minutes going room to room, and that Colin had answered the door and then walked straight out to the backyard, stood there the whole 40 minutes with both hands shoved in his pockets, not moving, just staring at the back fence. She said Declan got home from school at 3:15 and stopped on the front step when he saw the for sale sign that had been planted in the yard that morning. He reached out and touched it 2 fingers one moment and went inside. I had to put the phone down when she told me that, just for a moment. When I brought it back up, Loretta was still on the line, She said, "Leonard, that boy is going to be all right. You know that." "I know," I said. "Children can absorb more than we tend to think." "I know," I said. I raised one. I just wasn't careful enough about what I was teaching him. Loretta didn't try to talk me out of that. She said she'd keep watch and let me know if anything worth knowing happened. I thanked her, and meant every syllable of it, the way you mean something toward a person who has stood with you through your worst stretch without once needing to be asked, and without ever asking for anything back. 11 days after that, an offer came in on the house a hair above asking price, which Franklin said tracked with what San Diego County was doing at the moment. I said yes that same afternoon. That evening I called Colette and told her. She said, "Good. Then, now will you please tell me about Ventura?" And I said yes. And for the first time in a great while, I actually had something to say. Franklin had questioned me twice before drafting to make sure I was resolved. I told him once was enough. He had been working on the will for 3 weeks. I knew this because twice during that period, he had phoned to nail down particulars, the exact statutory wording that California requires when a testator deliberately omits an heir, and the precise architecture of the charitable trust I wanted named as principal beneficiary. He worked with the care of a good craftsman, not from self-doubt, but from the understanding that what gets built in an afternoon has to hold up for years, and so it had better be right from the first joint. Selecting the organization had taken its own kind of attention. Franklin pulled records on 6 nonprofits operating across San Diego County, all of them serving older adults who had been displaced, whether by illness, by family failure, by financial predation, or simply by the slow, accumulated pressure of a life that hadn't landed where it was aimed. He laid out summaries of all 6 for me. I went through each organization's annual report board disclosures and most recent audited financials, because after 40 years running a small business, I know that whether an organization actually does what it claims to do versus merely claiming it tends to show up in the numbers if you read them right. I picked the one whose figures were straight, read their annual report a second time before I called Franklin and told him to move. The morning of the signing, Colette came down from Pasadena and met me at Franklin's office at 10:00. She hadn't asked permission. She'd simply phoned the night before and told me she'd be there at 9:45, which meant she walked in at 9:40 and sat in the lobby for 15 minutes with a magazine she'd brought from home, because she had a settled distrust of the reading material available in waiting rooms. I came down from the parking structure, and she was already at the lobby door, coat button bag on her shoulder, wearing the look she gets when she's decided something important is underway, and her role is simply to show up for it without inserting herself. "You look rested," she said. "I am," I said. "First complete night's sleep in some time." "Good," she said. That was the whole of it. We went upstairs. Franklin's office held the view I had come to associate with the work of the preceding 2 months. West Los Angeles, laid out toward the water, the morning light in January, carrying that particular flatness that arrives after the marine layer burns off and the city stops softening its own distances. I had spent more time across from that desk in the last 8 weeks than I had spent across from any desk in the previous 10 years, and somewhere along the way, the room had come to feel like familiar ground. Not because of what you could see through the glass, or the quality of the furniture, or the coffee Franklin's assistant set down without being asked. Because it was a room where things that had needed resolving had been resolved steadily, methodically, one signed document at a time. Franklin took me through the completed will section by section. That same deliberate care he applied to everything, reading each paragraph aloud, stopping to make sure the wording actually captured what I meant before moving ahead. The first section brought the charitable trust into being and named its beneficiary organization. The second laid out what was being transferred, the Birchwood Street settlement, which had landed in my account the week prior at $1.2 million. 4 decades worth of savings built up through Vance Woodcraft, and the licensing royalties on 3 furniture designs, still being manufactured in Oregon, a steady, modest quarterly return that I had come to picture as the workshop continuing to earn its keep out in the world long after my own hands had found other work. The third section was the one Franklin had raised during our preliminary conversations. Under California law, a testator who means to cut a child out of an estate must name that child directly in the document, not as an act of spite, as a matter of legal clarity. The provision exists precisely so no one can stand up later and claim the absence was accidental, a drafting slip, a fading memory, the kind of mistake old men make. The disinheritance has to be a choice on paper, not merely a gap. It has to be declared and executed and witnessed. Colin James Vance named excluded intentionally and with full awareness of the legal consequences of that choice. Franklin read those lines the same even way he read everything, no rise, no dip in the voice, each word, given exactly the gravity it carried, and nothing beyond. I sat with both palms resting flat on the table. Colette was to my left. Somewhere in the middle of the reading, her hand came down on top of mine, and I turned mine over and closed my fingers around hers, and neither of us shifted until Franklin reached the end, placed the document flat, and lifted his eyes to me above the rim of his reading glasses. "Leonard," he said. "Are you certain?" "I am," I said. He gave a single nod and pushed the signature page across the desk toward me. My signature went down at 4:14 in the afternoon. The notary was a young woman named Willa, Franklin's office notary for 11 years, who carried herself with the settled composure of someone accustomed to presiding over moments of real consequence, without allowing those moments to show on her face. She pressed her stamp to the page, put her initials in the margin, and returned it across the desk without comment. Franklin countersigned as witness. He took the document to the county recorder's office before the end of the business day, and so before that January sun went below the horizon, the choice I had made was part of the public record. We shook hands at the elevator bank. Franklin told me, as he invariably did when a meeting ended, to reach out if something arose. I said I would. I meant it with less conviction than I once might have, because I had come to see that the matters calling for Franklin's kind of knowledge were largely settled now, and whatever came next would need a different order of tools. Out on the sidewalk in the January afternoon, the sun hung lower in the sky than I'd anticipated, and it touched my face with a warmth I wasn't sure I'd earned. I stopped outside Franklin's building and breathed Los Angeles in the exhaust, the thread of ocean salt, the dry mineral quality of a city that has absorbed direct sun all day. I stood there thinking about what Rosalind would have said. She would have said, "Len, you did the right thing." She would have delivered it the way she delivered most things she knew to be true, without ceremony, without making it feel like a judgment, just a plain statement of how things stood. And then she would have wanted to know whether I was hungry, because Rosalind held to the conviction that the body doesn't stop needing care just because the spirit has finished its most demanding work, and that sitting down to a decent meal after a hard day wasn't self-indulgence. It was acknowledgement of what the day had cost you. I was hungry. 2 blocks up from Franklin's building, I found a diner and took a corner table and ate lunch late and by myself. It ranked among the better meals I had during my time in Los Angeles. Not on account of the cooking, but because I was done. I could feel that I was done, and I had come through to the other side of it. Then I rang Howie. I told him I was ready. He said he'd already figured as much. Ventura smells like salt and cedar in the morning. That wasn't by design. It arrived that way the right things tend to, not from engineering, but from finally getting out of their path. Howie turned up the workshop in March, 3 weeks after that call. A garage that had been converted, sitting on an unhurried street 4 blocks off the Water North Light, falling through two tall windows along the east wall floor space, enough for a pair of workbenches and a table saw that held still when you used it. The landlord was a retired contractor named Bert, who'd fitted the place out for his own purposes, and then discovered at 71 that his niece had strong feelings about concrete floors. He took my hand, glanced at the crutch, and said, "You're going to be fine in here." I believed him. Howie and I signed the lease sitting at Bert's kitchen table over coffee that hadn't been offered, but was welcome. Howie put his name down first, sliding the pen over afterward with the offhand ease of someone who's wanted to do a thing for a long stretch of time, and won't allow himself any ceremony about finally doing it. I signed after him. When the pen came to rest, Howie lifted his coffee and turned his gaze toward Bert's kitchen window and the street beyond it, not looking back at me, and said, 3 years, Len, took us long enough. We got here, I said. We got here, he said. I had moved into a small apartment 2 streets from the workshop back in late February, before the lease papers even existed, because the previous 3 months had taught me something real about not holding yourself back from starting until all the conditions line up the way you'd prefer. The apartment, 1 bedroom, and a west-facing kitchen window that gathered the afternoon light in a way that caught me off guard, a quiet echo not unwelcome of the front room on Birchwood Street during the years Rosalind still filled it. I didn't push the place to feel familiar before it was ready. I let it find its own footing, the way new wood finds its equilibrium in a different room. No forcing, just time until the movement stops and the piece settles into itself. Colette came out for the first time in March 2nd, days after Howie and I unlocked the workshop. She made the drive up from San Diego County carrying a casserole dish tucked in a dish towel and wearing an expression she was visibly trying to hold level without quite pulling it off. In the workshop doorway, she went still for a beat, taking in the 2 benches, the tools arranged in their rows across the pegboard, the fine, pale ribbon of wood shavings that had drifted to the floor during that first working afternoon. "Len," she said at last. "I know," I said. She set the dish on the bench's corner and came to stand next to me and regarded the space the way I regard a board, before cutting, absorbing its full length and character reading what's actually there. Then she said Rosalind would have loved this. She didn't spell out who she meant. "I know she would have," I said. "We ate at the workbench because the table was buried under drawings." Colette didn't ask how I was holding up. She doesn't not head on, because she grasps that certain questions get answered more honestly by the presence of a shared meal at a day's end than by whatever words a person might produce if pressed. That is what it looks like to love someone who has carried something hard. You appear. You bring something to eat. You don't make them account for themselves. These days she comes every other weekend. Sometimes she brings along a friend from her book club, another maker of casseroles, who has developed a habit of addressing me as Leonard in a register that implies she considers the name more stately than I do. I don't object. Declan came to visit in July. Colin drove him up from San Diego County on a Saturday morning, pulling into the workshop parking lot at 11:15. The car was still rolling when Declan had his door open. He crossed the lot at a run, backpack swinging, both arms already reaching. He met me at roughly the same speed he'd come down that dark hallway 7 months before, and I caught the edge of the workbench with one hand to stay upright and wrapped the other arm around him and stood there without speaking because nothing wanted saying. He had the wooden box in his pack. He pulled it free and held it out, rotating it slowly in his hands, and said, "I've been keeping stuff in it. Good stuff." He showed me what was inside: a flat stone from a beach trip, a folded drawing he'd made of a dog, a note from a friend at school, and a small piece of pine with a rough edge that he said he'd come across in a parking lot and held on to because it carried the scent of my old workshop. I turned the piece of pine over in my palm for a moment. He wasn't wrong. It did. We put in 2 hours building a small wall shelf for his bedroom out of a piece of white oak I'd been setting aside for a project I hadn't yet named. Declan measured and I cut, and Howie showed him how to sand with the grain unprompted, because Howie is the kind of man who cannot watch a child drag sandpaper the wrong direction for more than 45 seconds before he has to step in. By the time they finished, Declan had oak dust across his shirt, and the quiet, concentrated look of someone who has made something real with their hands for the first time, and knows without anyone having to tell him that this is a different category of making from all the rest. When they left, Colin rolled his window down as he eased out of the lot. He looked across at me where I stood in the workshop doorway. Neither of us spoke because we hadn't arrived yet at the place where words between us would carry the weight words are supposed to carry. I had settled on that a good while back. I would hold out for the moment that was actually ready rather than accept an earlier one that wasn't. But he gave a nod, and I nodded back. That amounted to something. There are days when something is precisely enough. I am 65 years old. I have two hands that understand how to bring a thing into being from raw material. I have a sister who shows up. I have a friend of 33 years who put his name on a lease with me on a Tuesday morning and said, "Took us long enough," as though it were the most ordinary remark in the world. And I have a grandson who held onto a wooden box when everything around him suggested he let it go, and who picked up a piece of pine from a parking lot because it reminded him of something worth keeping. That is not a small life. That is everything. I have spent 65 years building with my hands, and the most consequential thing I ever built was not a piece of furniture. It was the steadiness to recognize when to stop propping up people who had already decided quietly to pull the whole structure down. If there is anything worth drawing from what happened to me, it is this. Love is not the same thing as surrender. I confused the two for longer than I should have. Don't make that mistake yourself. The people who are truly worth your sacrifice will never ask you to dissolve inside it. There is a way that the very things designed to break a person end up becoming the ground on which something better is built. I hold that more firmly now than I ever have. My own view is a plain one. Family justice doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it comes in quietly in executed documents and calls that go unanswered in a grandson who holds fast to a wooden box when the world says discard it. These are the reckonings that families seldom speak aloud, but they should because silence has always protected the wrong side. On Wise Revenge, there is more to come. That is where I will leave this story. Not because it ends neatly, but because the part that matters has been said. What this cost me is not easy to total up. Years of labor freely given. A trust I should have protected more carefully. A version of my son I had to finally stop waiting for. What it taught me is harder to put into words, but I'll try. I believe God does not waste the things that wound us. The most painful seasons I have lived through became in time the ground I built on. That is not something I could have told you while I was still inside them. But I can tell you now, if there is anything worth carrying away from this story of family justice, let it be this. Do not confuse loyalty with silence. Staying quiet to keep the peace is not love. It is a slow erasure of yourself. If someone's care for you only holds when it costs them nothing, that is not care. Name it clearly and act accordingly. Keep records. Not out of suspicion, but out of respect for your own future self. And do not let grief make you an easier target. The people who mean you well will wait for you to find your footing. The ones who move in quickly have already done their calculations. These are the kinds of dad's revenge stories that rarely make it into family conversations, but they should. Because silence, as I learned the hard way, tends to shelter the wrong people. If something in this landed with you, leave a thought in the comments. I read them. Share this with someone who might need to hear it. And if you want more stories about real family justice, the kind that arrives quietly and holds, subscribe to Wise Revenge. There is more to come. Thank you for sitting with me through this one. Take good care of yourself, and I'll see you in the next story.